Hello and welcome to the first video lecture for Music Appreciation Online. My name is Chris Wright. I am going to be your instructor for the semester, and I'd like to start off by saying that we are going to have these videos throughout the semester, and it will not be a full replacement for actual lectures, because if you took this class as a seated class, you would see me 3 hours a week, and I'm not going to have these web lectures be that long, because class time allows for students asking questions, in-class activities and things like that, and so you're going to get a more purified version of the lecture, because there really is no interaction here. You're simply viewing the lectures to have the material explained to you in a way that might be a little more suitable than just sitting down and just reading the textbook. It is advised that you read the textbook chapters that the lecture covers. In this case, we will be covering part 1, chapter 1 today. And so hopefully you've read through the chapter, or at least kind of scanned over it and seen the principal themes and terms that it covers. So if you haven't, you might want to pause the video right now and then unpause it after you've done so. Speaking of the textbook, this is what the text is. It's the Camion Music and Appreciation. Let me try that again. Music and Appreciation. It's the 8th brief edition. All the textbook info is located on Blackboard. And hopefully you've also seen on Blackboard that there is Connect software associated with this. So, and it could be that you bought just the digital version of the textbook where you don't have a physical copy, but you just bought an access card. That access card will give you a code where you've hopefully already set up your Connect account. And then when you log into Connect, you should see the ebook there where you can view the book. And it's really beneficial if you have a tablet or a Kindle or something like that, because it looks a little more presentable than say a computer screen. But laptops, it's pretty easy to use it with a laptop too. But today we're going to focus on the actual textbook and not how to get on Connect and all that other stuff. I have information about that on Blackboard, and if you're still confused, you're welcome to contact me, and I will do my best to walk you through what you need to do to get onto Connect. If you do have the textbook, a physical copy, or a digital version, you can open up the ebook. You may want to pause the video now, go ahead and get the ebook opened to part 1 and then chapter 1. And the name of that chapter is Sound, Pitch, Dynamics, and Tone Color. So we're going to be looking at all those words in that title, and we're going to be explaining to you some of the elements of music. You will notice that part 1 of your text is called Elements. And when you think of elements, you probably think of the scientific term of what an element is. You've probably seen the periodic table of elements in your high school science classes, or if you're taking chemistry in college, you will very much become aware of what an element is. An element is a basic building block of matter, and yes, you can go smaller than an element. You can get down to quarks and things like that, but we're keeping it kind of simple here in our analogy. An element is a building block of matter. For instance, if you have an iron bar, it's made up of iron molecules, and those iron molecules are fairly pure in that iron bar. But if you set the iron bar out in outside and it rains and it sits out there a few days, what becomes of that iron? It becomes something brand new, because it begins to bind with oxygen, and therefore you get 2 molecules of iron and 3 molecules of oxygen, and it makes Fe2O3, which we call rust. And so that strong shiny metal suddenly becomes this brown crumbly mess, just because the oxygen got mixed with the iron. So think of music in the same respect. If you think about what makes up music, there's basic elements that go in to make it up. And the more elements that you mix together, the more it transforms into something new. Think about the beginning of a hip-hop song or something like that, where it's just laying down the beat, and then maybe some chords will come in, and then the rapper comes in, and suddenly, and bit by bit, it's building the song up, transforming it into something completely new as each element is added to it. So we are going to be looking at melody, harmony, chords, texture, all the various aspects that build music up into the entity that it is. So, but first of all, we're going to talk about the first element of music, and that's sound. Sound is kind of a requirement for music. I mean, there was a guy in the 20th century named John Cage that wrote a piece of music that's called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, where a guy sits down at the piano for exactly 4 minutes and 33 seconds and does absolutely nothing. In other words, it's 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence, and that is considered a legitimate musical composition. In other words, there's no sound at all. Well, there is sound. He intended the audience shuffling in their seats, coughing, maybe even whispering next to their neighbor, what's going on here? He's not playing. Those were meant to be the sound of the composition. Now, for most music, when you think of music, you don't think of that avant-garde stuff that I was just talking about. You think of popular music, the stuff that most of us listen on a day-to-day basis. And we know it's consisted of sound. As a matter of fact, some people put extremely large speakers in their vehicles, and you can literally feel the sound if you sit in their vehicle. It'll rumble the windows. And so we're going to talk about the nature of sound and talk about what makes, for instance, this note sound different from this note. So we're going to break all that down for you scientifically, and you will have a much better understanding of how sound works. And the better you understand how sound works, the better you can understand how music works. Now, I do apologize if you can hear, I think there is a rescue squad or something going by. So my microphone's fairly sensitive. If it picks up the traffic outside, I do apologize. I have to do these recordings in my home because if I do them at work, I will have too many people. There's way too many distractions and noise in my office at work. So hopefully it's not too distracting. And I also have a dog, and hopefully she doesn't get see somebody walking down the street. She gets a little excited sometimes, so she gets the barking or you hear her nails click-clack across the floor. And yes, I do get them trimmed regularly. I do take good care of my dog, but she just has those kind of paws that they make noise even when they're well trimmed. So anyway, we are going to start in chapter 1 in part 1. This should be on page 6, I believe. Yep, page 6 in your text. No, I'm sorry. Hopefully you caught that. Hopefully you're like, no, you dingus, it's on page 4. So it's on page 4. We are going to get to page 6 in just a minute. But if you look at the top of the page, it says sound, pitch, dynamics, and tone color. So let's talk about what sound is first of all. You can place your hand on your throat and you can say a few words, and then you should feel the vibrations in your throat. And that's what causes all sound. Sound is merely energy in the form of vibrations. So when you're listening to a piece of music, you're literally just listening to a form of energy. And it's exhibiting itself through vibrations. And just like any other kind of energy form, just like heat, the further you get away from the heat source, the less you actually feel the heat. The same way with sound. The closer you get to the sound source, because that energy does lose, energy the further it travels through a medium. And depending on what kind of medium it's traveling through can affect that energy that we call sound. This is why when you're above water in the swimming pool or your bathtub, and then you submerge your head, that's why everything sounds so different, because the sound waves are having to travel through a thicker medium, which is water. And it transforms not only the pitch and other aspects of the sound, but it kind of, to our perception, it completely sounds different. And so that's why. So all vibrations create sound, but only certain frequencies of vibrations we can hear as humans. The standard range of humans is around 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz. Well, what's a hertz, Mr. Wright? Well, a hertz is the fluctuation of the sound wave. Sound is a type of energy that travels by wave. And so therefore you can measure the wave with modern devices. Now, of course, like the ancient Greeks, they didn't have an oscilloscope to measure the actual waves, but they could kind of sense, just using their ears, that this note was what they called lower than that note. And then they began to classify the notes based on their relative highness or lowness. And we're going to get to that term in just a minute. That's called pitch. But basically, you measure the sound wave, and the more frequent the waves are per second, 1 wave per second is a hertz. So if you were to make a sound at exactly 1 hertz, you wouldn't be able to hear it, first of all. But if you could hear it, then you would hear it for every second, which a second is about this long. You would hear it go, whoa, whoa, like that, like you would actually be able to hear the wave come and go. Much like the tides, the waves come in at tides. And once it gets around about 20 times a second, which again is pretty fast, then we humans start to hear it. And even then, it's really low. As you go up in frequency and you increase the rate of frequency, the notes become higher in pitch. Now, in our Western tradition of music, we have picked 7 specific pitches in each what we call octave range. And we'll be talking about what an octave is in a minute. And we've assigned them the first 7 letters of the alphabet. So we start with what we call an A. And this is one of the A's on the keyboard. Then we go up to B. Now B is vibrating at a faster frequency than A. And believe it or not, there's actually a note in between those. There's an A sharp, and depending on the context, you may also call it B flat. That note is in between A and B, and it's located in between. But even the A sharp is vibrating at a slightly faster rate than the initial A. And then you keep going up the scale, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then the next note is not H, but A all over again, because this A sounds very similar to the initial A you started on. So we're going to be talking about those octaves here in a minute. So the faster something vibrates, the higher the pitch it makes. And that's the word that we're going to get to next, which is pitch. Pitch in music is how fast or slow those frequencies happen. And pitch can be kind of relative, because although you might say this is a low-pitched note, it's still higher pitched than that note. So when we talk about pitch and whether or not it's a high pitch or low pitch, we always have to have a reference point. So you can't just say, without that reference point, if you play just a single note, sometimes it's hard to say if it's a high or low pitch, unless if it's an extremely high pitch or an extremely low pitch. Like most people would say, that's a really low pitch note, that's a really high pitch note. But if you play somewhere in the middle like that, and you ask someone with only that note, is that a high pitch or a low pitch? You're going to get mixed answers, because it all is relative. It's relative to probably their own voice. So you would probably have a lot of men saying that's a high pitch, and you'd probably have a lot of women saying it's a low pitch. So pitch is relative in perception. All right. When you look at the bottom of the opening page, page 4, you see our national anthem. It starts off, "Oh, say can you see?" Star Spangled Banner is the name of it. And these are the first 5 pitches of that, which are not notated for you in notes, but actual dots on the page written in a vertical fashion to represent the notes going up or down, because that's usually how we refer to pitch. We refer to it in the vertical way. Now, we are going to have a chapter coming up talking about rhythm and beat. In music, we think of rhythm and beat in a horizontal axis. So in pitch, we talk about notes going up and down, and you start on the note for O in Star Spangled Banner. O, say, can you see? And you can hear when you sing the word see, you're singing the highest note out of those 5. So you go down in pitch, and you can think of, let me get my hand on the screen here. You think of starting somewhere in the middle, and then you go down, and then you go back up, and go up to the highest peak that you have. Composers are aware of this. When a composer goes to write a melody, they generally reserve the highest pitches for the most exciting part of the melody. And you can even see this in pop music. Next time you're listening to your favorite pop song, it doesn't matter if it's hip-hop, country, or whatever. Because even in hip-hop, the people, even though they're rapping and they're not necessarily singing like in the national anthem, they still fluctuate the tone of their voice. Even me speaking to you, I try to fluctuate the tone or pitch of my voice, because if I didn't, I would be talking in a monotone and it would be very boring very quickly. So we instructors generally try to keep your interest by changing the pitch of our voice. And if I'm saying something that is very important, I'm generally going to reserve the very low pitches in my voice or the very high pitches in my voice for the most important words in the sentence. But do that next time you're listening to your favorite music. Notice if the extremes of it, the high especially, notice if the highest kind of pitch of the song or the lowest pitches even kind of represent very important parts or climatic parts of the song. All right, so moving on, we do have a term on top of page 5 called tone. Because we do need to distinguish that there are the sounds that are tonal or produce tones from those that don't produce a tone, that we generally just call noise. So, for instance, if I sing la like that, that is a tone because I am constricting my vocal cords in a way that I'm controlling the pitch to be around the exact frequency that I want. So I'm trying to put all my energy into singing something that the vibration stays relatively consistent. Now, if I clap my hands, notice that it doesn't produce a consistent pitch. As a matter of fact, it produces a combination of pitches. And it's kind of like when you mix colors. If you mix red and blue, you get purple. But if you start mixing too many colors at once, you just get a dark brown. And it doesn't even matter what colors you mix. So that's kind of what happens with noise. Noise is too complex of a sound for us to be able to process in our brains as a distinguishable pitch. So when we get to the percussion section of the orchestra here soon, you're going to hear us talk about pitched percussion and non-pitched. And what non-pitched would be is like the snare drum, which makes more like a gunshot sound. And it doesn't produce, actual melody like tones, melodic tones. So you may hear me call it melodic tones, but generally speaking, we just say tone. And when I say a tone, I want you to know that it's a regular recurring frequency. And so moving on, we have interval. Interval is just our fancy music word that talks about the distance between these tones. You must have tones for it to be a true interval because you can't really talk about precise measurements between noise. So if I play this note and then I play this note, you can hear that those tones are very close together. So it's not a huge interval between them. If I play this note and then that note, you can hear that the interval or distance between them is greater. So interval just means the distance between two tones. If you study music, like say as a music major, you have to learn all of these names we have for the different intervals, like a minor second, perfect fourth, and we're not going to go that in depth in this class because we just don't have time to dedicate to that, nor will you probably ever really use that much in your field of study. Even if you are a music major, you will have other classes that will teach you the difference between a perfect fourth and a diminished fourth and stuff like that. So when we use the term interval, I just want you to know that it's the distance between notes. And we will usually be using that when we dissect like melodies and bass lines and things like that. All right, the next term we have is an octave. If you know what the prefix OCT means, that's going to help you a lot. And you should know that it means 8. An octagon has 8 sides. An octopus has 8 tentacles. So in music, an octave means 8 notes apart. And these are the basic 8 notes that we have in music. And again, if we start on A, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the 8th note is A again. So we have the 8 notes. Now, if that's pretty simple, but here's where it gets a little confusing. Technically in Western music, we don't have 8 notes in a scale. We technically have 12 because those half steps that I mentioned before are in between some of these notes. So if you count them and you start on A and you play all the half steps in between them, you start at A and then you go up a half step. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 before you get to the next A. So the reason we call it an octave, though, is that if we're going to use what we call a scale, and we will get to the term scale later. If we use a scale, which is the basic building block in a key, another term we're going to get to later, we're only going to use 8 of those notes in most cases. If you've ever seen the musical Sound of Music, you know that the nun starts teaching the children music by teaching them the scales. And she starts off with the do, a deer, a female deer, and eventually she builds up the entire, what we call the major scale, that we're going to get to soon. And if you count the number of notes in a major scale, it is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Notice we don't use all 12 in the major scale. Now, you are permitted to use some of those half tones, but you have to have a good reason for using them. And we will get to that here very soon. But understand, when I use the term octave, I'm talking about notes that are given the same letter, and they're exactly 8 notes apart. All right, pitch range and range are other terms at the bottom of the same page. And basically what a pitch range refers to is the natural range of an instrument or voice. For instance, if I were to try to sing that note there, unless if I've had a cold all night, I probably can't even get near that low. Or if you were to play this note and ask me to sing that, it ain't going to happen. I don't care how much training I go through, I will never be able to sing that note and at least be able to sing it in a pleasing way. So my natural voice range is limited by my own vocal cords. Us men generally have lower pitch ranges than females, because when we go through puberty, our larynx, our voice box, as it's sometimes called, expands. And that's why you hear young boys, when they start to hit puberty, their voice sometimes fluctuates like that because they're still kind of getting used to this these new elongated vocal cords that they have. So some men have a naturally higher range voice. And we're going to learn starting in chapter 2 that we are going to actually give names to these vocal ranges. Instruments also have a natural range. For instance, clarinets can play a pretty extended range. Most instruments have a greater range than the human voice, and they're usually more versatile than the human voice. There's plenty of passages in like symphonies and stuff like that are just unsingable. The human voice is not agile enough to perform it. If you've ever seen the movie The Fifth Element, you know that the lady that comes out and sings, they had to digitally alter that because what she sings is so agile that the human voice can't do it. So it's a digital recreation using an actual singer. But it's been digitally altered to seem impressive, that an alien species could sing something that we mere humans couldn't. So when you look at an instrument like the clarinet, you talk about the pitch range. It's not just the physical notes that it's capable of doing, but also the notes that tend to sound the best, that sound decent to the ear. Because a clarinet can get really high in pitch, but there's a certain point where it starts kind of grinding on your ears, and it doesn't sound very acceptable. And so that's why when you hear a guy trying to sing like a girl, It takes years of training, and they have to do it very specific way for men to be able to sing in the upper pitch range. And when we get to vocal ranges, I will have a video on YouTube that I'll link to where I'll show you a countertenor, which we're going to learn is a male with an extremely high vocal range that occurs naturally. And they can sing way up in that range and sound good. Now, if I were to sing up in that range, it would sound like Mickey Mouse being murdered or something. It's not a sound that you would want to listen to. But again, we'll get to that stuff later. Now, to speed things along, we're going to move on to the second section, which is on dynamics. So turn the page over, and this is on page 6. Dynamics, the way that I tell many students to remember that is if you think dynamite. If you light a stick of dynamite, the fuse itself makes a very soft sound, very quiet. And then once the fuse runs out and it gets to the explosive part, then it produces a really loud sound. So that's what dynamics are. Dynamics and dynamite come from the same basic Latin root word. It means to change, essentially. So we're talking about music changing as far as volume. So we go from that soft fuse sound, which we would describe in music as like piano, to an extremely loud sound, which we would say like as a deafening fortissimo in music. So we're going to learn that dynamics means how loud or soft a sound is. And we're going to also familiarize ourselves with these Italian terms that you see listed here for you. We're going to learn a lot of Italian in this class, and the reason for that is because when we get into studying the history of music, specifically written music, where they started writing music down, Italy had a big impact on that, and so we're going to talk about that later. But for now, you're going to learn a little bit of Italian. The first Italian word you're going to learn is piano. Not the instrument you play with your fingers, but the actual word piano, which means soft in Italian. If you were to ask an Italian what a newborn kitten feels like, they would say piano. And we're going to learn when we talk about instruments and we get to the piano, we're going to learn that the piano is not its full name. So more on that later. Piano means soft though, and the way we represent that in music is we write a little P underneath the music, and you can see that on that chart. And if we want the music to be loud, we then switch to an F, which represents the Italian word forte. I know it looks almost like it's fort with an E on the end of it, and as a matter of fact, we get our word fort from the same Latin root word. It means strong, is what it means in Italian. So in music, we're describing loud sounds with forte, or a little F. Now, in Italian, if you want to say something is very something, at least when it comes to the terms piano and forte, they don't put a word in front of those words to modify it. They add a suffix on the end. And so they add issimo to the end of it. So if you want to say very loud, you say forte, issimo, and you put them together to form fortissimo. And we write that in written music with two F's next to each other. And for every F that you add to that, you mean the music is to get louder. Now, up until the 1800s, the middle 1800s, composers pretty much limited themselves to just two F's or two P's because they really didn't think beyond the scope of very loud and very quiet. However, especially towards the 20th century, composers began to literally put like 4 or 5 F's when they wanted the orchestra to be extremely loud. And the reason for that is because orchestras grew in size, instruments became more sophisticated, and the composers wanted a greater fidelity in which to indicate how loud or soft they wanted the music to be. But for the most part, we're going to limit ourselves mainly to just fortissimo, which means very loud, pianissimo, which means very soft, and then forte, which means loud, piano, which means soft. Now, there are two terms in between that use the Italian word M-E-Z-Z-O, and that is pronounced mezzo. It is not pronounced mezzo, but metzo, with a T sound right before the second Z. And the easy way to remember this is think about an Italian food you probably love, and that's pizza. Notice we spell it P-I-Z-Z-A. It's two Z's. And we don't pronounce it pizza. We pronounce it pizza with a T sound in there, again, before the second Z. So when you go to pronounce mezzo, please make sure you're getting a bit of a T sound in there. Mezzo. And so mezzo means medium. And so if we want the music to be a little louder than piano, but not quite piano, you put mezzo piano, or MP. If you want it to be a little softer than forte, but not quite as loud as, not quite a full forte, you put mezzo forte, or MF. So that's the varying degrees of loudness or softness we have. So let's go over that chart one more time. We're going to start at the very softest we can be, at least in most music. Pianissimo, two P's. Piano, which is one P. Mezzo piano, which is a little louder. Mezzo forte, which is a little louder than mezzo piano. Forte, which means loud. And then fortissimo, which means very loud. So in music, we don't always, immediately go from like forte to piano. Sometimes we want to gradually make the music louder. And when we do that, we write a symbol called a crescendo. Now, the only time you may have encountered the word crescendo before is if you either had some kind of band or choir experience, or maybe you took some kind of music lessons, or you may have heard it in the song Smooth Criminal by Michael Jackson. Look up the lyrics to that song sometime and you will see that he uses the word crescendo in that song. It is pronounced crescendo. It gets kind of that SH sound in there, so make sure you're pronouncing that. Crescendo. Practice saying it a few times, because we must remember that once you get out in the real world, people will judge you on your pronunciation. And part of being an educated person is exhibiting that you've been careful enough with your learning that you get down as many pronunciations as you can. Now, granted, we're all human. We all make mistakes. I will probably mispronounce a few words throughout the semester, but I do try to be as careful as possible. That's kind of what it will separate you as an educated person from a non-educated person who really doesn't care much about, usually if they mispronounce something or not. All right, so the opposite, if you will, of a crescendo, which is where the music starts, say, piano, but then gradually gets louder, is a decrescendo. And I know it looks just like crescendo with a D-E in front, but that D-E is pronounced day, like D-A-Y, like have a good day. So decrescendo is when the music is loud and then it gets softer. And we can go in between any gradient of dynamics. So you can have the music start forte and then write a decrescendo to mezzo forte, which is just a minor change. Or you can start forte and write a gradual decrescendo all the way down to pianissimo. By the way, there is another word for a decrescendo, and it's diminuendo. Again, try saying it a few times. Diminuendo. We get our word diminish from the same root word in Latin that the Italians get diminuendo. And it means the same thing as diminish. It means to fade away. So a diminuendo is usually used when the composer implies that the music should naturally die away. It should get almost so soft that you couldn't hear it. But you do see it used almost as a substitute for decrescendo in some music. Now there's different ways that you can represent this, and I'm going to try to get the camera here to focus a little bit. You can see these, they look like giant greater than and less than signs, and the length of these will change depending on the music. But that you can write them like that, or you can write in CRESC period to represent crescendo. There's various ways of writing this, and again, we're not going to get too in depth with the music notation in this class. But do know when I say listen to the crescendo, or if you're describing music and some of the written assignments you're going to do for the class, I want to see you use these terms. I want you to be able to discuss music with this terminology, because anything you study, whether it be welding or nursing or whatever, you're going to have jargon. You're going to have a certain set of terms that apply to that field of study. So if you need to get the lingo down. You need to get down these terms so that we can communicate with each other. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time communicating or describing music if you don't know these terms. All right, so the final thing we're going to cover is tone color. It's a bit of a cheat to just use a visual term, color, to describe something that you hear. But the reason we do that is that it's so terribly difficult to describe our senses using speech. To illustrate that, imagine if I brought someone in a class and I asked my students to describe to this person who had been born blind what the color red looks like. Well, think about how, well, I was going to say how impossible, but I think it is impossible to use the English language. Even as descriptive as English is, you really could not describe the color red to someone who has been blind their entire life. So sometimes our words fail us. And so in order to describe the quality of a sound, we use the term tone color. As a matter of fact, we use other visual terms to describe sound. We describe a trumpet as being bright. And that's not because you hook a lamp up to your trumpet. It doesn't produce any light at all. So we say that because we're using a visual allegory, if you will, an analogy, I think is a better word. Just like if you go to a movie and you're in a dark movie theater and then you walk out into the sunlight when you're done, it's almost so bright you can't even keep your eyes open. So the brightness of a trumpet may be too brilliant to play a softer, more mellow melody. So you may want to hand that melody to something like the English horn or an oboe or something like that that has a bit less brilliance to it, depending on the passage. We also, I want you to think of colors as far as the sounds of different instruments. Also, because you can use the painter analogy. As a painter starts to paint, they have different colors on their palette. The palette's that flat board that you see painters have. And they start off with just a few colors. And then as they mix and match the colors and create gradients in between the colors and blend them together, they're able to produce thousands of varieties of colors. And so it is with music. The more instruments you have available to you, the more you can play around and blend them. So if you take a trumpet or your trumpet section in the orchestra, let's describe that as red, and you mix it with the violins, which we'll describe as blue, you end up with a brand new tone color, which is purple. That sounds very different than just the trumpets by themselves or the strings by themselves. And that's how you mix and match sounds. So tone color refers to the unique quality of an instrument or voice. A tone color is the reason why my voice sounds the way it does. It's the reason your voice sounds the way it does. It's the reason that two people can sing the same song, but it has a different feel to it. Even though they're singing the same notes at the same pitches, at the same dynamic level, they can sing the song identical to each other. And unless if they're identical twins, they shouldn't really sound the same. This is why it's very difficult for people to impersonate other people. And the people that can do good impressions, that's why we find it so entertaining, because it's very difficult to reproduce the exact tone color of a specific instrument or voice. All right, so that basically does cover most of Chapter 1. It does talk about what your listening outlines are going to be like. If you're using the Connect software to access the listening outlines, some of these listening outlines will be part of your assigned work to do online. And yes, it will know if you try to skip through the recording or not. You will find that if, for instance, I give you 10 points to listen to a particular recording, if you start the recording, you'll notice that your points for that question will begin to change the more you listen to it. And if you skip all the way to the end, it will not award you any of the points for any of the music that you skip through. So none of the listening in this class is going to be like entire symphonies and stuff. I realize that with the modern schedule and everything, it's not. I'm not going to have you sit for like 45 minutes and listen to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So that's one of the reasons I use this textbook, is because I think the author did a good job of picking pieces that were relatively short that kind of illustrated the concepts that we needed to, but didn't take, a whole hour or so to illustrate it. For instance, your first two listening pieces, if you look at the total runtime, one of them is 3 minutes and 6 seconds. The other one is 2 minutes and 38 seconds. Now, if you don't have about 6 minutes to sit down and listen to those, then you really don't have time to be enrolled in a college class. So I'm not going to give you hours and hours of listening to do, but when I do ask you to listen to a piece, and no, it's not going to be every piece in your text. It's going to be it's going to be the pieces of music that I feel illustrate the concepts in the text the most. So when I do assign you a listening piece, make sure you do listen to it, and try to begin developing your listening skills, because that's part of this class. If you notice in the student learning outcomes on the syllabus, the class is designed not only to make you more educated about terms like tone color and water dynamics and stuff, but it also is designed to make you a better listener. And the simple fact of the matter is that in our modern culture, we've almost virtually lost the ability, not the ability, but the training to be a good audience member. Most of our music is what I call MIC music. It is designed to serve basically the same function in music that McDonald's serves with food. McDonald's is cheap. It's readily available. It's quickly produced, quickly consumed. It does the job. It's tasty just enough that you are not repulsed by it. But as you probably find as you get older, just like with fast food, now when you were 8 years old, you probably dreamed of eating McDonald's every single day. And that probably was like your fantasy when you were like 8 years old. But as you become older and more of an adult, the more that, even though you have to rely on fast food sometimes because you don't have time, the more you kind of realize that it's not very healthy for you, and it's okay in small bursts, but maybe once a week or something like that. But if all you eat is fast food, it's just not healthy for you, and it doesn't really take advantage of the unique flavors that are out there. Talk to somebody who is a chef or something like that. One of the things that chefs have to do is they have to train what they call their palate or their tongue and the different flavors, and be able to a chef can take a taste of something and almost tell you every ingredient in it. And or people that are into wine, they can take a sip of wine and tell you all kinds of things about it. Well, we want you to be able to become an above average listener, meaning that when you listen to music, you hear things that most people don't. Just like a chef can feel the texture of a food and describe it accurately, I want you to be able to listen to a piece of music and describe its musical texture, or what instruments are used, or how the bass line interacted with the melody, or how the harmony changed in the third measure of the piece. And it was an exciting, interesting choice by the composer. So you're going to learn the skills of how to be an above average listener, but you're never going to do that by not listening. Just like a chef can't improve his palate by never tasting a wide variety of foods, you as a listener are not going to be able to expand your listening abilities by listening to only hip-hop or only country western or only rock or only pop music in general. You need to expound those horizons and challenge yourself as a listener. Occasionally I listen to stuff that I'm not very familiar with, and sometimes it challenges my opinions about music. And it challenges the way I think that, even what defines music. I've heard pieces of music that my initial reaction was almost on the edge of violence. I mean, it made me so angry. It just disturbed me so much. I was just like, it made me uncomfortable. The Eminem song, Kim. I don't think I've ever gotten all the way through that song, because not only is the nature of the song, what he's rapping about is very uncomfortable, but you can almost hear it in the tone of his voice. You can hear the anger in the music, and I don't know how he was able to really encapsulate so much anger and hate and hurt in one song, but it's one of the few pop songs that really affected me deeply on an emotional level. I think that you will find that what we call classical music, which is, it's hard to define what is classical. It's not just a bunch of music by a bunch of old dead European guys. Classical music, I hear people talk about modern film music or music written for games, video games and stuff like that. People will call that classical music. Basically orchestral music, music played by an orchestra. I think that you will find that it has greater fidelity and greater richness than pop music, simply because it uses more instruments, and it usually involves people who have dedicated their entire lives to studying music. And that's not to say that you can't find that in pop artists either. There's some musicians like Dave Grohl or several others that I can mention that have done the same thing. They've given their entire lives to studying and producing music. And there's some very extremely talented people in the pop music industry. I mean, you look at Jay-Z and hip-hop and everything he's done, and continues to try to be innovative in his field. So I don't want you to think of classical music as like a snobby approach to music or a highly intellectual approach to music, because classical music can be just as fun and McDonald's-y as pop music. But we do want to, as college students, challenge our listening, try to become better listeners. And I think that these listening guides will do you better than just purely listening to the music, because the listening guides are they're your guides throughout the listening examples that you have. It's kind of like if you go to a museum and you have a tour guide, you're going to get more out of that museum experience because the tour guide's going to educate you. It's going to show you what to look for in the painting, who painted this painting, why did they paint it. I mean, all of those things enlighten you as to the experience. And so I think that you'll find too that the more you study something, the more you accept it. Because a lot of times people just reject a style of music because they're completely unfamiliar with it. Think about if you have someone speaking a foreign language around you that you don't know. If you're standing in the checkout line and two people are speaking Spanish in front of you and you don't speak Spanish, it makes you uncomfortable, doesn't it? Why is that? Because you don't understand Spanish. If you understood Spanish, not only would you kind of get excited that, hey, I know this, and I know that most people around me probably don't know what they're saying. So it makes you feel a little special. But beyond the ego boost, it gives you enlightenment. You understand what they're talking about, and you're less likely to assume they're talking about you and they're making fun of you if they laugh, which they're probably not. They're probably telling each other jokes or something like that. But we humans, when we're presented with something we don't understand, our natural knee-jerk reaction is to reject it. And so most people, the reason they don't listen to classical music, and again, that can include more than just 250-year-old European music, the reason that most people don't listen to classical or really any style outside of the style they were brought up on or whatever their culture teaches them, the reason they don't listen to it is because they don't understand it. Their immediate knee-jerk reaction is to reject it. So we're going to make you more culturally sensitive. We're going to make you more culturally accepting. And we're going to expose you to different kinds of music. And the way that we're going to do that mainly is look at the history of our Western tradition of music. Because every style of music that you have probably heard that you remember has mostly been based in Western culture. If you look at the way the East, like in China and stuff like that, the way they develop their music, they use different instruments, different scales and stuff like that, and that's why it sounds so alien to us. But this is why it's not that hard to shift from, say, country western song to a hip-hop song. I know people that like both genres, even though they're kind of culturally very different. They really aren't that different, though. As a matter of fact, if you study, even though we tend to classify in America, most people would assume that more people listen to hip-hop that are African-American, and more people that listen, or most people that listen to country and western are white. even though that's true, take an old country western star like Hank Williams, and who taught him to play the guitar, but an elderly African American who was a blues player. And so blues, a music that traditionally was only associated with black culture, made its way into white culture, and there's a lot of cross-fertilization. One of the most famous hip-hop artists of all times is Eminem, and he's white. So don't think of music so much as white music, black music, purple music, green music. That's limiting music to its cultural identity, or at least its cultural stereotype. And part of what you should do as an educated person is kind of reject stereotypes. Be able to listen to music and be more objective about, judging the quality or the aspects of that music. So these listening outlines that you have, and you have 2 of them in chapter 1, will help expand your horizons, or at least in theory they should, if you actually give them a chance. But take a few of them in stride, because the first few of them, it's going to be a learning experience for you. It's going to be a first time for many of you to have a guide through a piece of music, especially since this music may be styles you're not used to listening to. So give it a few tries. Wait until about the 4th or 5th listening outline for it to kind of become easy at that point to follow. And you may find that you have to go back and listen to the same song a few times to pick up on all the nuances it points out, because they do go by rather quickly. That's one disadvantage you have in a music class. Music is an art form that is restricted in the amount of time it exists. Painting, you can sit there and look at a painting for a minute or an hour. It doesn't matter. There's no time constraint at all. But if you and I are going to listen to the same song that lasts exactly 3 minutes and 6 seconds, well, it takes exactly 3 minutes and 6 seconds for both of us to listen to. So some of these songs, the stuff that it's pointing out, will go by very quickly, and it's okay to rewind or go back and listen to it again. All right, so that's going to pretty much conclude the first lecture in the online series, and we will have more. Some sections of the textbook I will need to focus more on in the lectures, because I have noticed after teaching this class for 11 years full-time now, there's certain sections of the textbook that really do need a person to explain to make full sense, because although your author is extremely good and efficient at explaining most of this stuff, there's a few holes that I feel like he maybe could have filled in a little better. So we will be addressing those. We won't be addressing, again, every single concept. I did go through this initial chapter fairly in depth, but I did that mainly to give you a kind of insight into what I'm looking for, as far as what information you should glean after reading the chapter. So not every chapter is going to get its own dedicated video like this. We will need to pick the pace up in future videos. Feel free to contact me with any questions or concerns that you have regarding this chapter or this video. And in the future, we'll be explaining some more stuff, and hopefully you'll be able to enjoy it. Feel free to watch these videos as many times as you need to, or review parts of them. That's the advantage of having a recorded lecture like this, is that you can navigate it however you want to. So make sure you check the other aspects of this week's assignment. Every week you will get a fresh assignment to do, and then as long as you do that work within the deadline and get it turned in completed, then you will receive attendance for that week, as well as the grade for the assignments. And more about that on the syllabus. You can check out how your final grade's determined and all that stuff. So anyway, yeah, just contact me with any questions or comments or anything. All of my contact info, and there goes my dog. So you may hear her occasionally in videos from time to time. Apparently she sees somebody outside she doesn't like. But you can check Blackboard for all of my contact information, and so there's really no excuse. I even give my personal cell phone number out on that, so you're welcome to call or text me if for some reason you do contact me and I don't respond within 24 hours, try recontacting me, because I am human. Occasionally, sometimes I overlook emails or I forget that I got text or something like that. So if in 24 hours you don't hear back from me, remind me. But you generally will hear back from me fairly quickly. Anyway, that concludes our first lecture, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot, and I look forward to our future videos together.